Hello, I'm Tyler Thompson, aka Space Explained, and welcome to another video. Starship, one of the most ambitious and insane vehicles to ever leave paper. It will be taller, more powerful, and more capable than the Saturn V. It will dominate the space industry due to being 100% reusable. So in December of 2020, we saw the test flight of SN8, the first full-scale Starship prototype to hop, and it flew beautifully, and even almost landed. We have been following SN8 for months, but out of nowhere, SN9 showed up, but I guess it wasn't ready to have all the attention, so it just tipped over. We ended up following SN9 through its repairs and its extremely long testing campaign, which included 6 static fires. If you want to know more about SN9's lifetime, watch my other video about SN9. Suddenly, out of nowhere, we hear more about SN10 getting its final preparations done to roll out. Soon after it did, SN9 flew and had a run on the landing pad. Then SN10 had its flight, and then after SN11 did SN11 did its flight too. On top of that, SpaceX has skipped SN12, 13, and 14 to move on to SN15, which is supposed to have many big upgrades. And SN15 is almost done with initial stacking. How are they producing these things so fast? Well, that's what we will be talking about in this video. I'll be going over why SpaceX skipped 3 prototypes, what about Starship is so ambitious and different to what has been done in the past, that they need to make this many prototypes in the first place, and I will give a basic understanding of the past/future development of Starship prototypes. Anyways, let's get started. SpaceX has had plans for a very big rocket since they started all the way back in 2002. The plans changed drastically every year until in 2018 they announced the change to stainless steel. We then saw the first Starship prototype, Starhopper. It still featured the tri-landing leg/fin design, but it would be the first time that a methane-fueled, full-flow staged combustion engine was ever used to do any work. SpaceX switched to the design that we now know, and production started booming. They first built the Mark I and Mark II prototypes simultaneously, but the Mark II prototype has since been abandoned and scrapped. Mark I became the first prototype to get all of its aero surfaces and a nose cone, but the entire nose cone section was moved prior to testing. Mark I then blew its top during a pressure test, and so it was pretty spectacular. After this, we saw SpaceX switch from calling the prototypes Mark to calling them SN, or serial number. SN1 did a kind of explosion, implosion, and then explosion thing when the thrust puck failed during a pressure test. It explodes out the bottom, and then since the liquid nitrogen still has inertia, it continues to fall out of the prototype, creating a vacuum and crushing the thin tank walls. Think of it like when you are drinking from a plastic water bottle. As you suck the water out, the thin plastic walls start to crush inwards. Since the methane tank on top was still intact, however, when the prototype hit the ground again, it exploded again. SN3 collapsed due to the LOX tank being underpressurized and the methane tank crushing it. SN2 was a test tank that was pressurized until it popped to test how strong the new thrust puck and welding technique were. SpaceX also switched from welding hundreds of panels together to welding rings together on SN1, so they needed to test how strong the rings were along with the thrust puck by making a test tank. SN4 was the first full-scale prototype to pass cryo and pressure testing and do multiple static fires, but shortly after its 5th static fire, it exploded. SN5 was the next prototype to go through testing, and it was also the first full-scale prototype to fly. It has since been dismantled, and sadly, but SN6 did the exact same thing and has also been dismantled. SN7 was a test tank and has become the serial number for all their test tanks so far, excluding SN2. So far, there's been SN7.1 and SN7.2, and SN7.2 is currently sitting at the build site. SN8 was the first full-scale prototype to fly with all of its aero surfaces and was the first prototype to perform a controlled descent using aerodynamic flaps. Its final big achievement was doing the flip maneuver, although it barely didn't land due to low header tank pressure. SN9 basically repeated what SN8 did, but also failed to land due to an engine failure. SN10 had a remarkable test flight around a month ago, and it did absolutely amazing. It had a great ascent and almost identical to SN9's, belly flopped, and then lit all three of its engines for the landing flip maneuver. It had all three engines running until all the horizontal velocity had been scrubbed off from the flip, and then transitioned to one engine for the super slow final landing maneuver. It then landed, which was just absolutely amazing. But something that I noticed was when the two Raptors shut down for the final bit of the landing burn, one of the vents caught fire. I like to think of this as kind of a fuse because after it landed, we saw a big fire at the base of SN10. The fire seemed to have been put out, but then after about 8 or 9 minutes of SN10 sitting on the landing pad, it suddenly took flight again and belly flopped straight into the ground. I assume that since there was a fire heating the engine bay so much, it ignited the fuel and gases that remained inside the tanks, which made it go boom. I still see this as a complete success, however, because they probably would have scrapped it anyways instead of reflying it. SN11 rolled out soon after SN10's test flight, and just barely flew and had another rud. It lifted off in the fog, so no one but SpaceX really got a good video of it, except for Trevor Mahlmann, who found a small patch in the fog where he could film the belly flop maneuver, and he said that SN11 appeared to wobble a bit more on its axis than previous flights. This indicates that there may have been a failure with the belly flop maneuver, but the other theories include an engine failure, but one thing is for sure, it was right over the landing pad yet again. You can hear 2 engine ignitions and then boom. You can also see debris falling on most of the feeds, and a few of everyday astronauts' cameras may have gotten taken out. So hopefully they are okay, but note that even though none of these launches have been a complete success, none of them have been failures by any standard either. Every time that they launch, they gather more and more data. I do have a suspicion, however. I think that suborbital pad B is a little bit of a bad luck launch pad. For the last 7 launches, it has just been pad A. And all of the prototypes that made it to the pad after SN4 did really well. There has been then there's pad B. SN9 had a much worse attempt than SN8. I think we can all easily say that. And SN9 had a much worse attempt than SN10. So we're kind of seeing a trend here, don't you think? Both with odd numbers and with the suborbital pad B. Don't you think? That's just my superstition. Anyways, you would expect there to be SN12 next, but we have instead seen SpaceX skip past and scrap the parts for SN12, 13, and 14 and move on to SN15, which is stated to have many major upgrades added to it. Anyways, why has SpaceX skipped 3 prototypes anyways? Well, due to the amazing success of SN8, I'm willing to bet that SpaceX thought they would stick it on SN9 or SN10 or SN11, which they did, and so they just decided to move on to what people are now calling Starship Block 3. The switch to the Block 3 prototypes is crucial to go higher and faster, so this may also be a very big reason that they are skipping these 3 prototypes. Amidst this, we have also seen the ramping up of production of BN1, the first Super Heavy prototype, along with the orbital launch mount speeding up its completion process. I think that after SN11, we will see the first Super Heavy booster roll out. It has been confirmed that SpaceX's first Super Heavy booster will not do any testing and was just a manufacturing pathfinder, however. BN2 has room for up to 8 Raptor engines on its aft dome, so things are getting pretty exciting down at Boca Chica, or Starbase. BN2 will also be the first prototype to hop. Elon also stated that they are targeting July for the first orbital launch of Starship using BN3 and SN20. This just goes to show how close SpaceX is to going orbital with Starship. I'm very willing to bet that SpaceX will hit their deadline since we've already seen parts for these two prototypes produced. Also, at the rate that SpaceX is going, they're likely to start launching 2 prototypes a month, maybe 3. And seeing that we are just barely in the third month, at the end of the third month of the year, I am willing to bet that we will see Starships all the way up around SN30. And even if they only fly once a month, that still adds up to be around SN20, which will still be orbital by December. So, calculating the amount of booster prototypes is a little bit more difficult due to there being no Super Heavies to fly to date. But I'm willing to bet we'll see one every 2 to 3 months. But I think that after BN1, we'll see ramped up production of these prototypes just like we saw after SN8. So at this point, you may be wondering, why go through all this effort to make so many prototypes that aren't even going to leave the atmosphere yet? Well, Starship is doing so many things that no rocket has ever even attempted. Namely, I'm talking about the crazy belly flop and landing maneuvers. Starship has unique flaps that give it a very recognizable shape. These flaps aren't just for aesthetics, and are for the belly flop maneuver that Starship performs. Starship does a belly flop to lower its terminal velocity as much as possible by using as much surface area as possible so that it can waste the least amount of propellant on the landing flip maneuver. It uses its flaps to control itself during its unique descent that brings us to the craziest and hardest part of Starship's flight profile, the flip maneuver. The engines have to be facing down to create upward force, obviously, but at the time they're facing sideways. Starship could use all of the RCS power it has, but it will never be able to complete the flip in time. To solve this, SpaceX previously let 2 out of the 3 Raptors for the flip, but they will now be lighting all 3 engines as we saw on SN10. This does, however, induce a ton of horizontal velocity, which is scrubbed off by overcorrecting the flip and gradually retaining a vertical position for the final landing burn, for which one of the 2 engines is used for the flip is turned off. This is a very tricky thing to master and is one of the most critical parts of Starship's reuse. So SpaceX needs to get this down before going orbital with Starship. So yeah, now you have a basic understanding of SpaceX's design philosophy and why they are producing Starships so fast. Among other space news, we recently got a better look at what a black hole looks like when the scientists mapped the magnetic fields of black hole M87. I hope that the resolution increases until we have an HD view of the first black hole to ever be photographed. On top of that, NASA's Perseverance rover recently dropped the protective shielding that was covering the Ingenuity helicopter from debris. It then drove to the spot that NASA deemed worthy to support the first aerodynamic flight on another planet and lowered the helicopter to the vertical position. It then deployed the other set of legs. It will now be dropped onto the surface of Mars, and then Perseverance will drive away to a safe distance to observe Ingenuity's first flight. NASA also said that they included a small piece of fabric from the Wright brothers' first manned airplane, which I think is super cool. Anyways, all my sources are in the description below as always. You can follow me on Twitter at SpaceExplained, same thing with Instagram. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.